ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, we're a little behind schedule, but we don't want to stifle the conversation. So if you would please indulge us, we're going to move the schedule by 30 minutes. So we'll finish at 12:30 and everything else will be moved subsequently. So the forum itself will finish at 5. I hope that's all right with most of you. We have the room until 6. So, with this kind of thing, one has to play it by our time. So we appreciate your indulgence on that. All right?
I'm going to introduce you first, Kent. So Professor Kent Carpenter from the US, a marine conservation biologist, an expert in all things fish, tropical reef fish. And we did a study together in French Polynesia, and Kent is going to talk about the marine conservation potential of pearl farming more from a scientific perspective.
Thank you, Laura. The work that I'm going to present today was published earlier this year in Marine Pollution Bulletin. And it stems from a study that we did in French Polynesia in 2012. We visited the Ahe Atoll in order to understand the impacts of pearl oyster farming on abundance and diversity of reef fishes. So I was responsible for the experimental design, for collecting most of the data, for helping out with the statistical analysis, but it's really the very hard work of Laurent Cartier who really made this project a success. Laurent not only initiated the project, he did the fundraising for the project, and most importantly in my mind, he made sure that this project was published in a peer-reviewed, high-impact scientific journal. And this really lends legitimacy to the results that I'll present to you today. I want to thank up front Jacques Brumlett, who actually provided the impetus for this study. Laurent found out that Jacques had asked me to do some of this type of work in the Philippines, and so Laurent asked me to do it in French Polynesia. Obviously, I agreed. We have to thank the National Geographic Wave Foundation for providing the funds for this expedition. Josh Humbert was our very gracious host during this particular expedition, and he and Andy Barden both provided some excellent National Geographic quality photographs from this expedition. And it really is the intense conservation ethic of Jacques Brumlett and Josh Humbert that convinced me that I should be spending my time, my research time, trying to understand the marine conservation potential of pearl oyster farming. Okay, our basic question was very simple. What are the impacts of pearl oyster farming on the local abundance and diversity of reef fishes in Ahe Atoll? Now, the Ahe Lagoon is very intensely farmed. There are 77 concessions in the area that cover about 11% of the total lagoon area. Reef fishes are a very important and conspicuous component of the lagoon, so they're an easy thing to measure in terms of impacts of pearl oyster farming. And our unit of measurement here was the coral bommie. Okay, a bommie is simply a pinnacle that rises up from the floor of the lagoon and typically comes to within just the surface of the water. Sometimes it breaks the surface of the water at low tide. And there are many, many coral bommies scattered throughout the Ahe Lagoon. All these little dots here are all coral bommies. And some of the coral bommies have pearl oyster farming activity associated with the bommie, and some do not. Okay, so it's easy for us to go out and study the reef fishes either on impacted bommies, which are the ones with pearl farms, and non-impacted bommies, which are the ones without pearl oyster farms. Now, as we know, pearl oyster farms have a very intimate connection with all of the reef fishes. These reef fishes are common and conspicuous components around pearl oyster farms. And pearl oyster farms have very imposing structures, these nets that hold all of the oysters themselves. But we have to also think about not only the impacts of the pearl oyster farm in doing this type of a study. We also have to keep in mind the natural fluctuations in the lagoon. We have to take these things into consideration to make sure that we are truly measuring the impact versus the non-impact of pearl oyster farms. So it turns out that probably the most important thing to consider in this lagoon, in our experimental study, was the impact or the position of our bommies, the position of the bommies with respect to the only open pass going into the ocean. Now, fortunately, Ahe Atoll is one of the best studied atolls anywhere. There are many published scientific articles about the oceanography and biological components of Ahe Atoll. So we know very well about such things as flushing time, so how much time it takes for the lagoon to replace the water from the outside through the pass. So this blue area here shows that this area has a very, very high turnover time because of its proximity to the pass. The deep reds here show a longer flushing time, so this has water more stagnant than other places. It's a deep red. Okay, so you see that proximity to the pass, and also there's a very different pattern north of the pass and south of the pass in terms of flushing time. So these are natural fluctuations that we have to take into consideration. If you look at the studies of the circulation within Ahe Atoll, you'll see again that there's not only is proximity to the pass important, but there are different circulation patterns north and south of the pass. And this translates into very different larval circulations in the Ahe Lagoon. And this is something that we have to take into consideration in our study. Okay, so we chose stations around the western side of the lagoon, and we took note of the proximity to the pass, and we could measure these sorts of things, distance from the pass, and so on and so forth, using various methods. So we used a method in order to understand the abundance and diversity of reef fishes. We use something called the roving census method. This method is very sensitive to the diversity of fishes because we record each and every species that we encounter during this roving census method. We also try to understand the relative abundances of the fishes that we encounter. So rare would mean we encounter a species only once. Few means we encounter anywhere from over 1 to 10. Many is from over 10 to 100, and very abundant is over 100. This is a logarithmic scale, so it gives relative abundance of these species. And we use scuba diving and underwater slates where we record each and every species that we count and the relative abundances during our roving census method. These are timed censuses. Each one is 60 minutes, and therefore we can compare between places using a standardized methodology. We typically go down to 20 meters, or the deepest part below the bombing, and then we very, very gradually circumnavigate the bombing, typically 3 times in order to make our way all the way to the top. And this gives us a good indication of all the species at different depth ranges from deep to shallow in our census. Okay, right on to the results here. I know that there's a lot of numbers up here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the individual numbers. What we should keep in mind is that impacted means that there was a pearl farm there. Non-direct impact means there was no pearl oyster activity, pearl farming activity close to that station. We also use different methods of coding our abundance data. This was just a way of making sure that there was absolutely no question in terms of the upper and lower limits of the capability of our methods of collecting abundance data, that this was robust with respect to this particular measurement. H is our measurement of diversity. And the only thing I'd like you to see in this particular table here is the fact that no matter what method of coding we used for abundance, always impacted had a higher number than the non-impacted. So this means there's a greater abundance in the impacted compared to the non-impacted reefs. Okay? Okay, so our statistical analysis, we used something called an analysis of variance. It's a two-way analysis of variance. If you're not familiar with statistics, that's not really important. What's important to understand is that this was a very highly significant result. Okay, first off, in a two-way ANOVA, you have to make sure that there's no significant interaction. This means that the factor impact of pearl oyster farms did not interact significantly in a statistical manner with other factors here, which were position relative to the pass and distance from shore and other measurements. Okay? Because of this, we could use the most sensitive results, and the most sensitive results resoundingly showed that there was a significantly higher abundance of coral reef fishes in areas in proximity to pearl oyster farming. Okay? So this very, very small number here means that there was a minuscule chance that the results that we got were due to some random factor. Okay? So this is just means that, yes, there's more fish, there's a greater abundance of fish in areas in proximity to pearl oyster farms. Okay? And just I should also mention that regardless of which method of coding we did, even if we use the less sensitive means of detecting statistical significance, each and every time we came up with a very robust result showing that there are greater abundance of fishes around areas with pearl oyster farms. And yes, in fact, there was an impact on abundance of reef fishes depending upon where they were in position to pass. So it was important for us to statistically consider the other factors there. But this means that we were able to tease out these two different factors. Impact from the pearl oyster farms was essentially separated out from the impacts of the natural physical environment. Now, for diversity, which is measured here in different means, different ways using H, we actually found that diversity, there was no significant difference in areas that were impacted or areas close to pearl farms as opposed to that were not impacted. So what this means is that there is no negative impact of pearl oyster farms on the biodiversity of these coral reef colonies. Okay, so no impact means also no negative impact. Obviously, we have a positive impact on numbers of fishes, but there's numbers of species, and in fact, also the community of the species that we found. We had another statistical method here called an ANOSIM, analysis of similarity, and this basically found that there was no community structure difference between impacted versus non-impacted sites. Okay? So this is a good thing. This means that there is no negative impact of pearl oyster farming. So this basically was a very high probability that any difference we saw between impacted and non-impacted was just simply by chance. Okay? So why? Why are fishes more abundant on pearl oyster farms than where they're not pearl oyster farms? And I think this is fairly straightforward. These structures that are part and parcel to where pearl oyster farming is done are attachment sites for food for fishes. The fish feed on these sites, and in addition, fishes are feel much more comfortable underwater if there's structure around. So when there's structure around, there's less probability that fishes are preyed upon by predators, and because of that, they feel more comfortable wherever there's structure. These are essentially artificial reefs that are being constructed in proximity to coral reef colonies. Okay? And in fact, you see a lot of the fishes, such as surgeon fishes and butterfly fishes, that are found in higher abundances around these structures because these structures provide the food that these fishes consume. There's no harm to the biodiversity. This is what our result showed in terms of diversity. So there was no significant difference. This simply means that there is no decrease in diversity. So no fundamental change in fish communities means that there are no negative impacts because of these pearl oyster farms. So how does this compare with the Philippine results that I had done several years ago, about 7 years ago? And our preliminary data from Buksuk and also the other area, Taytay in the Philippines, where Jewel Mare has some pearl oyster farms. Our initial results actually showed a higher diversity in areas with pearl oyster farms. We didn't really have enough time to do enough replicates in order to test this significantly. So this is something that we have to go back and confirm or test further, I should say, by increasing our sample size. So we need to follow this up. We need to confirm this. Fortunately, the rolling census method is something that's repeatable. It's something that we can do across different geographies and also across different time scales. Okay? So it's a very powerful method, but you have to have sufficient sample sizes. What I observed at Jewel Mare was that this activity obviously has an economic benefit to the local communities. It provides livelihoods. It obviously provides human well-being because of the economic benefits in this area of the pearl oyster farms. I was very, very impressed with the conservation ethic of Jewel Mare. They constantly are going out into the community and trying to impart upon the local communities the importance of conservation of coral reefs. Obviously, a nice pearl is produced in a nice environment, and the best way to ensure that you have a nice environment is to make sure that it's conserved. And they try to get this message out wherever possible. Probably most important is the fact that in the Philippines, which undergoes intense, very, very intense exploitative extraction methods, these marine protected areas in the Jewel Mare area provide a de facto well-protected marine protected areas. There are over 1,000 marine protected areas in the Philippines, but unfortunately, most of these protected areas do not have enforcement that is sufficient really to protect these areas. In the Jewel Mare pearl oyster farms, they obviously have to protect their investment of the pearl oysters in the water, and they do this in a way that also prevents illegal fishing and other destructive fishing methods to occur in the area. So these end up being very powerful de facto marine protected areas. Okay, so what are our conclusions? Pearl oyster farms do, at least in the Ahe Atoll, increase local abundances of fishes. I don't think anybody in here would say that an increase in the abundance of coral reef fishes is a bad thing. I think that we would all agree that this shows that we have a healthier environment, and this is something that is borne out also in the scientific literature. Farms don't appear to degrade localized diversity. In fact, in Ahe Atoll, there was a slight increase in diversity of impacted versus non-impacted sites. This was not shown out to be statistically significant, but I think that if we had been there another week, we probably would have been able to do enough of a sample size where this would have been also statistically significant. That's my hypothesis. The hypothesis needs to be tested further. So for the Ahe Lagoon, the present farming model is a positive conservation statement. I think it's very easy to say that the farming changes the local habitat. There's no doubt that it changes the local habitat, but I think it does so, at least in this particular area, in a positive way. Pearl farming represents a positive conservation business model that produces a very nice product that enhances the human well-being around the world in many ways. It provides local livelihoods, and I think that if a pearl oyster has the proper conservation ethic, that it also provides a very powerful means of promoting marine conservation. There are remaining questions, so we really need to find out the long-term effects of pearl oyster farming. What we did here was a one-off study. It was done for Ahe Atoll. We can't overinterpret these data. What we would like to do is build on these data and try to understand better what are the long-term effects. So I would like to encourage anybody who plans on starting, like, for example, a new pearl oyster farm, that they try to contact Vaughn, who will immediately go out and raise the money so that so that we can go and do some roving censuses in an area before a pearl oyster farm is put into place, and then go back afterwards and study it again. I'm sure everybody here probably agrees that there will probably be very good scientific evidence that indicates that pearl oyster farming does in fact enhance marine environments. We need to understand the different sites. So the Philippines is an entirely different habitat than Ahe Atoll. Ahe Atoll is different from what you'll see in the Gambiers. Gambiers and Philippines and Ahe are all different from what you'll see in Australia and also in the Sea of Cortez. So we need to really go back and look at all of these sites using standardized methodology so that we can all show that the industry is in fact something that can be sustainable, again, with the proper conservation efforts. Very happy to see that biodiversity and conservation is something that the consumers are reacting to, and I'm very happy to see that Julie Nash is spending the time using that information that she has gathered in order to promote really what is an important message, and that is that the best way to be sustainable, to be responsible, is really to apply a conservation ethic to such methods as pearl oyster farming. So, and again, thank you all for inviting me here, and it's very much a pleasure to be a member of this panel.